it's 2 minutes past, everybody, so let's get going. It's really lovely to see you all. I'm really happy that we have developed people who become interested slowly in the ideas behind the concepts of literacies that we've been presenting through the year. We had a particularly hectic season in July when we were dealing with digital literacies and the ideas around those. And let me just show you that I'm a real person, as in, because we then segued through, and thanks to Lizelle, into the concept of communication literacy. What is it that we mean when we want our students to be able to communicate effectively, and also to go back to our academic literacy discussion, academic literacy being understanding more than reading and writing, but how you position yourself within the world and how you interpret and how you respond as part of that understanding, that concept of positionality as part of your academic literacy. So today I wanted to move on to what we were calling associated skills of communication literacy. Lizelle did mention some of them last week, and we start off with the concepts that we think we could teach, because after all, this concept of communication literacy has entered our curricula. We all have little snatches in terms of health science teaching about things like role-playing on Breaking Bad news, and how would you write a circular to staff talking about I don't know, antibiotic stewardship policies, those kinds of things. So those are communication strategies which we understand we need, and therefore, as part of our, I hate it when people call it that, but they call it the soft skills development. I prefer, as my CHSE colleagues know, to talk about power skills, because the power skills are those that enable you to exist in a workplace positively. And so, yeah, how do people communicate becomes part of something testable that we have to show that we've put into our curricula and that we are testing. So I'm going to use the chat a lot, or the whiteboard, depending on how we get there. And I don't know if we can open it for everyone to write on. Let's use the chat to start. I'm going to ask you to drop into the chat how you, in your own position where you currently are, what is your best strategy for communicating with your students? That's interesting. All right, Lizelle, thank you for starting us off. That's interesting. Face-to-face being really important. That's interesting. Ganesh, you're also saying in person. So, yeah, okay, WhatsApp also works a bit. That's interesting. All right. And Ganesh, are you saying that the learning management system is effective for you?
Hi, Shirra. So we use, depending on the time. So if we can get the students here all together, it'll be in person. Otherwise, the WhatsApp groups that we formed, and then just to make sure the learning management system works, because we know all students are connected, so nobody can say they missed the communication. So we put it on multiple platforms, so we know that students would have received it. But the first option is face-to-face.
That's interesting. So I want everybody who feels like in-person communication is the number one option. So Vanessa said in person. So I want you to go in with your react button and respond. To personalized messages. That's also important, especially depending on the number of students you have. That's interesting. And Christine is telling us about communication on the learning management system, chat room and email and announcements, etc. That's interesting. Okay, Gavin, you're agreeing with the in-person. Nobody else is sending me messages. Okay. That's interesting. So still in this technological day and age, we're thinking that in-person communication leaves the least opportunity for misinterpretation, or somehow if we've said it, we believe the students have heard it.
That's interest. That's interest. That's interest. That's interest.
And Lizelle raised the issue of the written communication, like WhatsApp and email can sometimes be misinterpreted. So that's very true. Even if you're using words that you consider, say, not pointed or inflammatory, somebody else might read something different into what you're saying. Gavin, join the conversation.
That's interesting.
Hi, Shirra. So I just wanted to comment, I think, to link your claim, or at least
Yes.
perhaps what you that if students would know it if we said it, or hear it if we said it, and then
Yes.
Lizelle's comment that it can be misinterpreted. I think the strength in person is to have the dialogue. I think what I like about it is the
That's interesting.
the conversation you can have to dispel immediately any miscommunication, any misinterpretation, and actually get a sense if they have heard it. So it's not just about saying it means there, it's about being able to have this live, dynamic conversation to dispel any issues. And I think that's ideal. And you can obviously simulate that electronically. But there is a bit of a intuition you get when the psychology of looking in someone's eyes to really communicate is well known. And I think that's what I still latch on to be the most effective, empathetic listener and communicator.
That's interesting. So Gavin, you've raised like so many points there. And I do think it's important to unpack them. The first one is we're talking about communication, so it's two ways. So people are saying when you stand in front of your class, you need to say the message so it'll be heard. Okay, which is a skill all in of itself to start off with. The second thing is, how do you know that you've been heard? So what confirmatory feedback systems are there in that face-to-face encounter that allow you to know if the students have heard, if they've understood, which is something different itself, and lastly, if they understand the actions they have to take as a result of what they've heard. And then to close your loop, Gavin, if there are misunderstandings or misinterpretations, how do you then come back and fix them straight away? All of those are relying on the fact that there's a cycle going on here, which is that people speak and they're heard, so people listen, and there could be action as a result of that communication, which is the standard communication cycle. So where most skills associated with communication position themselves is in the very first instance in what they call active listening.
That's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Now, active listening relies, I think, on very much like people throw out the idea of active learning. If student is engaged in the classroom and they're doing something, then their learning will be better than if they're just sitting back. I'm not 1,000% on board with that, because active listening is a great gateway to active learning. And by active listening, that means
that's interesting.
Listening to what the person is trying to put across, and then finding space in your own head as to what that means.
That's
and we can then digress into all those theorists, people like Noam Chomsky, who said that words label ideas, and that even though we all see the same word, we all think different ideas as a result of that one word.
That's interesting.
So gauging understanding is difficult if we're only going to be using words. And in terms of listening, how do we know that somebody's heard us? If you're an active a listener, supposedly, you make sense of what you're hearing. And then in some ways, what you can do is confirm what you heard before coming out, especially in a collegial situation, with what you think about what that person has said.
That's interesting.
Which often happens. I actually see it happening in our PG Dip classroom. People are taken by something that you've said, and you can start seeing them formulating their response before you've even finished the point of what you're talking about. And that means they're not then listening to you anymore in an active sense. Your voice is just droning on. So Lizelle, yes, what you're raising now is point 2. So active listening is the first part of really good communication, supposedly. Are you hearing what's going on around you? And then secondarily, how are you interpreting what's happening? So if somebody's speaking, but they're disengaged, they're showing you all the verbal cues of, folded arms and chin dropped and not making eye contact. Those are all things where you can see that your message isn't actually being received as you'd like it to be.
That's interesting.
And the more that you're able to interpret those cues, the better you're able to tailor your re-communication. So in other words, what we're saying is that non-verbal cues are part of the feedback on how your communication is being accepted and is being held.
That's interesting.
And I see that Vinesh likes that too. Okay, let's not talk about whiteboards at the moment. So in terms of developing skills, in terms of the types of communications that we have, they spoke this morning, and it was a concept I really liked, are what are your levers within a communication event? So on the one hand, you have your own knowledge, your own skills, coupled with your own known biases and your unknown, so unconscious biases.
That's interesting.
And I really like the idea of exploring those as things that influence communication. And it could be in a positive or in a negative sense. But all of those things make you who you are and the stance that you're taking.
That's interesting.
So the example I use is my very known bias that there is no such thing as foundational knowledge. That when students learn knowledge, they do learn.
That's interesting.
I'm trying to think of a non-inflammatory word, but they learn clumps of information that they hold together, and then they eventually aggregate that information into a working, usable whole. And anybody in the basic sciences says to me, oh, no, that's nonsense. They need to be able to recruit that basic knowledge and then apply it, and that means they know something. So we're coming at cross purposes immediately, because that's not what I'm talking about how you're teaching what your basic concepts are. I'm talking about how that information becomes knowledge and becomes useful to that student in their application. So there's my position. And then there's the basic science position. And in that communication, often we're missing each other because we're speaking at cross purposes. And how do we regularize that communication? I think part of that is, yes, understanding the language, but also part of it is interpersonal management, which leads to this whole idea of communication being a skill.
That's interesting.
So they spoke about levers in interpreting communication correctly. The first one really is collegiality.
That's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Christine, I'm going to leave you to tidy up the board as we're going. We can do bullet points there.
That's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting.
The university understandings, they unpacked.
That's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting.
3 other levels. So we expect to interact as colleagues. It's one of the first rules of the PG DIP. As you walk through the classroom door, everyone's on a first name basis, because we're colleagues. Because colleagues can learn from each other. They can listen actively. They can hear things that don't resonate with their worldview. They can start to see somebody else's point of view. That doesn't mean you're ever going to agree with the other person, but it does mean that you feel empowered to create that safe space where the discussion can actually happen. And I think that collegiality speaks to the things that we spoke about in our abstract this morning: respect and trust and empathy. because if we don't have that basis, then we don't see each other as colleagues. And all the other micro kind of environments then apply. Nobody's kind of calling me on that. If there is really space for true collegiality, in the kind of university environment that we're in. Okay, yeah, Liz, I'll go ahead.
I might be opening a can of worms, but the collegiality that you are referring to assumes that people are adults and are able to put their own needs and assumptions aside and be able to listen and hear what other people are saying, and not just listening to attack and to tell people, no, you have got the wrong end of the stick. This is the way it shall be done and would be done, and that's my way is the highway kind of thing, which is not the case. We all have our comfort zones and ideas that we are not willing to move on, just because we don't know better, or well, that's my assumption. So not to say that it's true for everybody, but yeah, I don't think we've ever been called out on whose truth or who's word the zoo in and whose word count. Basically, yeah.
Okay. I hear you. That's interesting. I didn't even interrupt and say, and say, does that actually happen? So here we're saying that for collegiality to happen, and there's that link. You need to assume that people will not be so invested in their own position that they cannot hear anybody else's point of view. And that then leads to empathetic treatment or respect of a colleague, which can ultimately lead to trust. So they're not all thrown in the same basket. That's interesting. Yeah. And if we're not in that position, then how do we take it forward? Sue, are you going to join that part of the conversation?
Yeah, I think a lot depends on the student's previous experience in a learning situation.
Yeah.
Because Lizelle and I taught college students for years before they came to university, and they actually come with the idea that the lecturer is always right, and they find it incredibly difficult to challenge us. So it was only after they really got to know us, after weeks, that they started feeling okay and comfortable to do that and express an alternative opinion.
So I love that you raised that, because how we've been enculturated, I think, makes a huge difference as to how we communicate. Because there are cultures where certain people aren't allowed to speak in the presence of other people. We come, and of course, I've just come from this huge diversity, inclusion, and equity workshop. So we're saying we're moving away from the racialized and hierarchicalized patriarchal society, and we're allowing everybody a voice. Well, allowing people a voice doesn't mean that they change from the cultural background that they have been raised in. And if you traditionally didn't have a voice in that background, then how do you challenge somebody's thinking? Or how do you even contribute to the conversation? That's interesting. What I was building up to in terms of us saying that face-to-face communication is preferred from outside, as people who've had that experience of being able to engage and to collaborate and to share our views. Our students are not necessarily in that same boat. And it's amazing to me when I go and I do peer reviews for people who are wanting feedback on their lecturing. That's interesting. And I look around the class and I see that there are people who are engaged, people who are not. But in any case, the ones who ask questions are kind of the ones who always ask questions in the class. Then after the class, there's a whole group of students who rush to the lecture and ask their questions after the class. And lastly, there's a whole group of students, usually around towards the middle back of the room, however the room is, who wouldn't dream of asking a question. And when I sit and chat to them, like during a break, and say, why don't you ask that question? They go, oh, no. That's interesting. So the environment is such that they feel disempowered to ask anything. Whereas there are other students who are not. That's interesting. And part of communication literacy for us as lecturers, as opposed to students, is understanding that when we build this environment where we want to invite people in to speak and to get involved and to share their own views, we're breaking down so much of their preconceived notion of what they're allowed to do, which is exactly what you're saying, Sue. Their environment was such that they couldn't conceive of asking a teacher a question, because in the school environment that they came from, that meant you didn't believe the teacher. and that was a bad thing in their view. So that's interesting. So although for us it's the most comfortable and the easiest way of communicating with our students, I don't think that they see it the same way backwards. I am not sure that every single one of our students is comfortable to engage with us verbally, face to face. And some of that relies on language issues, although students make huge strides in language communication when they come to, for example, university, where they're reading and speaking and talking to their colleagues in a language which is not their first mother tongue. So I think that it's not necessarily a language issue so much as an understanding of educational possibilities issue. And if we make university the same as school, where people have to learn facts and then tell them back to us, then they're going to treat their communication opportunities the same as school. Whereas some schools encourage debate and ability to ask questions and other schools don't. And then that leads us back to the idea that we're empowering the powerful students more, and we're disempowering the ones who don't see that as their ideal way of communication. I'm not saying that electronic means of communication is their first choice either. That's interesting. I personally feel that if we have to work with large groups of students, that the way to get them to engage is to make those groups smaller. But that means that you, as that facilitator, has to work so much harder to make that connection with each one of them, as opposed to saying, well, I told the class. So if the class didn't hear, that's not my fault because I said it in class. I don't know how many times I've heard that said. Christine, join the conversation.
That's interesting. Sorry, mic was muted. As someone who was a recent student, I found that actually using both methods worked best. Having a blended method of communication where in class the lecturer would make that personal communication, the personal connection, and explain his thoughts and reasoning. But in an announcement, they would post, okay, these are just to confirm, this is the date that we talked about that your assignment is due. Feel free to contact me during these days if you need some assistance. We have an additional review class for that assignment on that day. That way, all the dates, times, and so forth is in an announcement. But the personal help and personal communication was in person. Now, the reason they did this was because in the lecture hall, the sound system sucked. So sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And it really depended. And if you had an off day where you couldn't project your voice as much, students in the back of the class couldn't hear you. That's interesting.
See, that is one of the attributes of being able to communicate effectively, is that people can hear you, literally, physically. That's interesting. And that's a vital part of developing communication skills, If the student can't hear you, then no matter how much you speak, they're not going to see you. Not gonna, yeah.
It was also one of the classes that I had. Participation was mandatory, and the lecturer got very mad if you said you couldn't hear them, but they also never did anything to fix it either.
That's interesting. Yeah, so very topical. Let's take the teachable moments and look at our differently abled Miss South Africa. That's interesting. Well, she said, yeah. Joy?
Yeah, I'm gonna mute my mic soon, but yes, that hall was for about 200 students, by the way.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, so who knows the issue that I'm speaking about now? How differently abled Miss South Africa. That's interesting. Anybody see her on the news this week? That's interesting.
I think she's well deserving of Miss South Africa.
Yeah. So she said quite clearly, you don't have to be PC with me. You can call me differently abled, which is apparently the PC term, or you can call me disabled, which is apparently offensive. She said, or you can call me deaf, because that's what I am. That's interesting. And I found that very refreshing, because what she was saying was it's an acknowledgement of her whole person, that she's not defined by what she can't do. And she's obviously making her way with a whole lot of things that she can do, which I think is unbelievably laudable. And I think that's interesting. That not hearing is sometimes just not because the student is not actively listening. That's interesting. And we don't make accommodation for that in terms of making sure that physically students are able to hear, and that what we're saying is completely audible. That's interesting. I also find it's not just the language that we use or the words that they have to actually hear, but it's what they hear when you say those words. That's interesting. I've had some really lovely howlers over the years of things that I've said as part of my natural idiom that people construe perhaps literally and think I really that's interesting saying that. And it's just a figure of speech, for example, like getting caught in the deluge. And that's interesting. Of over information coming into the student, and what they're actually hearing is that I stood out in the rain. That's interesting. That's interesting. So I think that the issue of physical issue of being able to make sure that everyone in your class can hear is a big deal. And also because you're standing at the front and you don't hear that the air conditioning units on top halfway through the class is drowning you out because you can hear yourself at the front. That's interesting. Yeah, practical aspects are important. So now we've spoken, let's break it down into the aspirational idea of active listening, where somebody's actually not only listening to your words, but listening to your meaning as well before they start formulating a response. So it means it has to fit into some sort of their worldview. That's interesting. And then the physical aspect, which is audibility and pace and practicality. And I'm adding in the announcements and the tech as part of the practicality, because as lecturers, we need to develop sufficient skill to be able to do those small things. Post an announcement, make sure that your dates on the calendar in the learning management system are accurate. Those are all parts of good communication, and that fall under the practical skill. That's interesting. So then let me backtrack to say if those physical parts of communication are there, then what is stopping that student from joining the conversation or from being open towards the communication that you have? And we come to the three indented bullet points of what they spoke about today in the session, and that's the idea of corporatization, which universities unfortunately fall under more and more. That's interesting. And the concept of hierarchy stunting communication. That's interesting. So in the corporate world, there's a boss, and people have to do what the boss says. Otherwise, like Elon Musk can do, you can fire 500 people at once and say you're not doing your job. Bye. I don't know if he got taken to the labor court for doing that, but yeah. So in terms of top-down communication, that's interesting. If people who were perceiving us at the bottom as being students, then they certainly feel disempowered in terms of developing the skills of being able to argue rationally, perhaps, and put their own point of view forward. That's interesting. And even when we give them the opportunity, so I sit on a lot of, committees where students are invited in to give their opinions or to give their feedback, they sometimes become quite militant about it because they're perceiving their right as being a consumer in this food chain of ours because they or their parents or their bursars pay fees and therefore we owe them something. And that changes the nature of the communication. Because if we're talking about wanting to be part of the class and being an active participant, etc., once you come into the class feeling like you're a consumer and that you are owed certain things, like for example, for years, the GMP classes felt that they were owed notes because they paid part of their fees went towards notes. So every single department was told, you have to give notes. That's interesting. Whether that it was really an important part of their learning, I'm not sure, but it became the narrative. And I feel like it disrupted the communication within the class because a lot of students came, picked up the notes and left. So they felt that was their entire interaction and didn't come to engage with what it was they were supposed to be learning. That's interesting. I wonder if you have examples of where you feel that your students feel owed something and that is then disruptive of the communication that you have. That's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is a tricky one because I do believe that students are our customers. I mean, so there has to be a useful relationship. And if you use that analogy and take it further, if you're a customer of Checkers and you particularly like cherry flavored yogurt, if the manager is able to explain to you that the cherries this year didn't ripen and therefore there were no cherries in the country to make the yogurt, you would understand and you certainly wouldn't go to Pick and Pay because Checkers didn't have cherry yogurt anymore. So I think it does depend on the relationship you have with the students and explaining your point of view and the expectations of the students. And generally, I find students quite that's interesting. Happy to accept reasonable explanations. Thanks.
So that's a good point. A reasonable explanation. And in a way it attenuates their expectation. But my worry about this concept of corporatization is that we set the bar too low. That if students come in feeling like they're consumers and that they are owed whatever it is that we are presenting in terms of the Coursera program or whatever, they don't take ownership and responsibility for that's interesting. Their part of the interaction when we're talking about communication. That's interesting.
I have got another take on this, in the sense that I haven't experienced students expecting things because I could navigate and explain my position. However, I have heard of lecturers complaining that students don't want to engage in different ways of learning because they are experiencing traditional lectures or whatever the case may be in other courses. However, I am now just thinking, is it an assumption of us as lecturers to think that the students are just wanting without engaging with them to say, what is it that you need? Why are you asking this? But we are assuming now the students will behave in this manner, and therefore we don't want to explore because it might be comfortable for us to stay the way that we are doing it. So therefore we don't have to change. So we use the students as an excuse not to conform or not to adapt or not to change. This is again an assumption from my part. It's not to say that it is true, but
Okay.
it might be a reality for some.
So
of
Sue's
us.
agreeing with you loudly with the cat tan. I absolutely agree with you. Students only learn to expect from their experience of others who've been through the degree, for example. And that's why students who are exposed to a new curriculum are so uncomfortable, because they feel like the guinea pigs and they feel like nobody's done whatever it is before them. And so I do think that the communication channel has to be well described for them to be able to express that disquiet or the lack of surety, the lack of confidence.
That's interesting.
I think, though,
That's interesting.
that if we're thinking about what the student wants versus what we want of the student, those contracts could be better explained. And we see this very clearly, I think, in the postgraduate arena, where students feel perhaps sometimes that their supervisor is not invested in the project that they're doing or their research. And their supervisors feel like students aren't engaged and they're not taking responsibility for their own research.
That's interesting.
So those instances where there could be, as I spoke earlier, a cross-purpose communication are places where we need to think about unpacking how it is that we get our point across and how it is that we understand whether we've been understood.
That's interesting.
So the concept of dialogue is something that I think is important as a skill set. And again, it relates very closely to the active listening part. So although you are listening and you're actively listening and saying, confirming, so am I correct in understanding you to say this and that and the other? But the dialogue comes in where the other person is also actively listening. So then they're hearing your counter argument, and then they're able to come to some sort of equilibration. So the counter argument of that there are no cherries in the country to make cherry yogurt makes a lot of sense. Except if the student then feels that cherry yogurt is their due and they tell you, well, you have to import it from China where there are cherries and, take the consequences, which sometimes happens, I think. So part of our armamentarium then, if we're talking about active listening, and let's get it down.
That's interesting.
Is dialogue.
That's interesting.
And that's interesting related to dialogue, but perhaps more formalized is debate.
That's interesting.
In our health science environment, debate is not often encouraged. We're telling you the facts. You must know the facts. Just go away and tell them back to me. And even if it's about talking about a differential diagnosis, and then in this particular patient, what you feel the most obvious diagnosis could be, that's not a debate. It's about showcasing what you know, and of necessity, what you've noticed in a way.
That's interesting.
And so I think that part of what we miss out on in our interactions with students is the opportunity to raise these kinds of issues. And it's one of the things that the students in, for example, the classes which really encourage this, like the health system science segment on medical humanities and history. So they were given a project, for example, looking at the legislation around the use of Depo-Provera, and then they went into the concepts of women's rights and of the abortion legislation and of legislation revolving around women's choice, etc. So they really had a chance to explore that, given the environment they were in. But in a lecture theatre, there isn't really space for us, even in our blended learning environment, to engender that dialogue and debate. So I'll take your opinion on whether you think the discussion tool or the forum tool in Moodle allows students that richness of debate.
That's interesting.
That's interesting for you.
That's interesting. 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 That's interesting.
Go ahead.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Shirra. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. It's how you facilitate it. I think, and I think you've pinpointed a few key issues. If you encourage them, or you equip them with the literacy, for example, the word that's been coming up in my mind is to steelman an argument in a debate, because that's really a really good reflection of active learning, or active listening, sorry. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a debate format, but perhaps it's about that literacy of first communicating the other person's opposing view as clearly as possible, and then giving your point. And then it circumvents that thing that, no, it's not just what I know. I also want to know what you know, and engage in this dialogue. And that obviously elevates it to critical thinking. And it's not just about response, it's about engagement. But I think it's hard to, I think not many people are explicit about how that needs to take place on a forum. We take for granted that forums, we'll put up a discussion and people will, and students will engage how we'd like them to engage. It's a discussion, but no one actually, what does a discussion really entail? What are the expectations of a discussion? Is not explicitly stated.
So I think you're quite right, and it also leads then to that free work of setting up the expectations for the student, and also the instruction. So the last point that they brought out in the workshop that I was in this morning, which really gave me pause for thought, is for every discipline, as we know, yes, Christina, you're quite right. For every discipline, there is a way of communicating within that discipline. So, for example, you're a student assisting a qualified surgeon in an operation, so the surgeon can be telling you things. This is the way we do it. But the environment, the context is such that there's not a huge discussion or debate around it, because it's about the skill, and it's about the learning, and it's about the opportunity. That's interesting. If you are talking about the kind of thing that you raised now, Gavin, developing a debate, allowing people to think critically, that's a very different space for learning. And I've seen some good cross-pollinated ideas lately to try and take us out of our disciplinary ways of learning that we are so entrenched in. For example, in the maths education classrooms across the road, they've been trying to bring into the one set of courses writing intensive mathematics. So instead of just working with numbers, they get their students to write about their thought process as they're working through these quadratic equations or whatever they are. And it's really interesting how it makes a difference to how they can articulate their discipline. That's interesting. To how we used to say, well, if you can do an equation, then you can pass, because you can do the equation. That's interesting. That's interesting. And that I think gives us pause for thought. It gives us pause to be innovative, to think about different ways of how we articulate the knowledge that we want our students to have. And so that it doesn't become the discourse of the discipline. This is the only way that you can speak about, for example, I don't know, patient management in nursing, or whatever we're particularly speaking about. That's it also then gives us space to bring in the last of the skills which I wanted to raise today, which is the concept of social justice in communication, which is also different from restorative justice. So in restorative justice, we're looking at historical malfeasance, if you like, and allowing people an opportunity who had not an opportunity before.
That's interesting.
In social justice, I think I heard it as the distinction was that it doesn't matter where you grade on the hierarchy. And if we're speaking to looking at the whiteboard, Christine, you want to move the whiteboard across a bit still so that we can still see the first lot.
That's interesting.
Okay,
That's interesting.
It was really nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. You must be exhausted having traveled and come back into all of this. So I'm coming back to the idea of hierarchy. Christine, I don't know if you can move the board across a bit for me. I seem to be stuck with
I don't think it shows what I'm seeing. It shows everyone's own view.
Oh, does it? Okay, that's interesting.
That's interesting.
You're right.
I wonder if I can force it.
Oh, no, don't worry.
That's interesting.
If it's my own view, then I can go back to seeing what I'm seeing. Anyway.
If you click on the hand,
yes, yeah,
that moves it.
Yeah, I got you. Good, thank you. You see, what a learning opportunity. So if I had rules on how to use the whiteboard that everybody else was seeing differently from me, then I would have known.
That's interesting.
So the social justice speaks to the hierarchy, the fairness of how people land in their grades within the hierarchy, and how you can communicate between hierarchies. So when I planned this conversation that we were going to have, I went back to a movie that I've used in the PG quite often, which really speaks to this particular issue of hierarchy in our science communication. Has anybody seen the movie Wit? It's really old now, but stars Meryl Streep. So it must be part of the lexicon.
That's interesting.
It's heartrending. So don't watch it for enjoyment. No popcorn here.
That's interesting.
But the movie revolves around a very intellectual, able woman who gets cancer. And it's her experience, and it was way ahead of all of those books like When Breath Becomes Air, where medical people experience the medical system and how inhumane it is, and how it devolves patients to really the lowest level, even if they're fantastic neurosurgeons. So that's the basic message of the movie, is her experience of how they managed her in the treatment of this cancer. And
that's interesting.
And one of the most poignant scenes for me was how she became friendly with the night nurse, the nurse who was allocated to her in the night shift, because it was quiet and they had that opportunity to speak, and the nurse really gave her that courage that she needed to face this thing that she was facing.
That's interesting.
And one of the things that she put out quite early on in her notes was a do not resuscitate message on all of her case notes, because she said there's really no point to living a half-life as a vegetable, which I would be, and I don't want to be that.
That's interesting.
The scene that I would have played you was very poignant in that there was a registrar, a medical resident on call on the night when she started to experience cardiac distress. And the first thing he did was he pulled the code red, and he got the whole team in, and everyone was, defibrillating and all of that stuff. And this very junior night nurse kept saying, there's a DNR in the notes. You can't do this. It says in the notes that she was pushed completely out of the way. It was actually quite heartrending to see. And then eventually she got through to the resident, and she said, why are you doing this? And he's saying, it's my job. I don't care if the patient says we don't resuscitate, but this is my, it's like what I should be doing. And I found the entire thing completely devastating, because we are training students to be human beings. before they're healthcare practitioners, but also to have the critical thinking skills to develop not only compassion and empathy and respect, all of those things to everybody in the team, not just the seniors or whatever. And then to have the trust, so the courage of the system, if you will, that what the choices that they made were correct in that context.
That's
So
interesting.
to be able to say it didn't resuscitate because that was the patient's direct order, and not to be then called up in an M&M and told you did the wrong thing because of whatever you did, which was clearly what he feared when he was involved in doing that.
That's interesting.
Okay. We came a full circle of where I wanted to be today, which was to unpack this technical idea of communication and how we teach it to a much deeper understanding of what it really means to communicate and what it really means when we think we've given over a message and when a student sends a message back to us.
That's interesting.
What lenses we have to wear, I think, to be able to understand how those messages move the learning experience forward.
That's interesting.
How we can better do that.
That's interesting.
Stop right there.
That's interesting.
To give us some idea. Yes, thank you, Lizelle.
That's interesting.
It's a review. It's actually also possible to get the full movie online. It's ancient, so yeah,
that's interesting.
Very useful. Thank you.
That's interesting.
It's a tall order, I think, and it's something that you have to work on every day. Trying to intuit your own unconscious bias. I mean, people do workshops and stuff on that, but also trying to keep yourself real, for your own reality check in what you're doing and how you're doing it, and also how you feel you're being responded to. Because sometimes when you feel people are responding in a way that you didn't expect, maybe it's part of something that you're not recognizing in the situation.
That's interesting.
Maybe I'm going to stop there now.
That's interesting.
Cheers, Gavin. Thank you for your participation.